Good morning. My name is Chris Fox, and today's video is kind of fun, kind of long. I wanted to explain why science fiction authors are so paranoid right now. If you have lived in the world, you know what's going on in 2021. You know about all the crazy events. You know, there's the virus that shan't be named that just will not go away. There are economic challenges where a lot of us are dealing with inflation, where the food that we put on our tables is more expensive. You know, crime seems to be up in a lot of areas. I mean, there's a lot of concerns for a lot of different people, and I know those vary a lot based on where you live. In my case, I've got wildfires. You know, I spoke to my mom this morning, and she's got hurricanes. I mean, we all have our individual challenges depending where we're living on the globe. But for an author, particularly a science fiction author or a thriller author, I mean, there are a number of genres this will apply to. So I say science fiction, but you're going to be like, wait, that applies to my genre too. That's not just sci-fi authors. Yes, you're right. This does apply to a very broad swath of authors, but I had to pick one for the title. And I think it is most true of science fiction authors. We extrapolate into the future. We look at what exists now, and we think about humanity, and we think about what problems humanity is going to attempt to solve or encounter, and then we write accordingly. And if you are a science fiction author who writes post-apocalyptic fiction, you've really often gone down the rabbit hole and thought about what does the collapse of society look like. And so the reason why a lot of us are freaking out is many of the signs that we would expect to see that would herald the coming apocalypse, you know, are coming. And this is not the first time. I think every generation believes, oh, we're the last ones and you know, we're going to see the biggest collapse. And I remember back in 2007, especially, I had worked in mortgage for 6 years at that point, and I had a really good understanding of how finance worked and how terrifying it all was, and how much fraud and what a shell game it all was. And I was convinced it was all going to come crashing down. There was like no way we could go beyond 2007. I was convinced of it, and I argued it passionately like we were done. And then we bounced back, you know, and we kept on moving, and the apocalyptic times that I thought were going to come did not. And during this time, this time of hopelessness, when I believed that the world was ending, I even went down the conspiracy theory rabbit hole, as many people have in their lives, you know, where you start watching a few of these videos and hearing all these theories, and at first they sound great. You know, many of them are, it starts out with, you know, it's fractional reserve lending and the federal government, and you need to watch out for this, and it ends up, and then there's lizard people. You know, they get really wacky. But as an author, it's fascinating to see the sum of all the knowledge out there and the directions people have taken it. But one in particular leapt out at me, and that's the crux of this video. That's the whole thing I want to talk about. It's the process of subversion. And it's how you bring down a government without firing a shot. You do it from within. You take that government down without ever firing a shot. And it was first coined, the concept, by Sun Tzu in The Art of War and some of his other writings. And then it's been built on since then. So you can think of like modern espionage and subversion as stemming back to Sun Tzu, him maybe being the father of both of those disciplines, what we would think of. And then, you know, if you think about spy thrillers today, if you think about, you know, the US versus the Soviets, all this stuff has been perfected. And I saw a video a while ago, and I've recently watched it again, by a gentleman by the name of Yuri. I'm going to butcher his last name. I want to say Bezmenov, but we'll see if I spelled that correctly. In any case, he worked for the Soviet Union, and he worked specifically for their propaganda division. So it was his goal to subvert specific governments, and Bangladesh was the nation that he was assigned to. And he had to engineer a specific series of changes. And they gave him a playbook. And this playbook is pretty terrifying. So we're going to cover it today. I'm going to go over the basics of what he preached. And I'm not suggesting in any way that this is happening in the United States or any other nation on the planet right now. But when you hear the entire system, it's impossible not to see similarities and to worry. And I would encourage you, you know, if you are prone to accepting conspiracy theories as I am, don't read too much into it. There could be any number of explanations, and I choose to always be optimistic. I think, you know, we as a society will bounce back from this and figure out a better way to communicate. I think this is just growing pains of the internet and social media and us learning to adapt to these tools. There's a lot of division going on right now, a lot of strife, but you'll see how it mirrors this process of subversion that he described. And it's a little bit long. This might be longer than my usual video, but I think it's interesting information and worth covering. So let's go ahead and jump into the next section. Phase 1, demoralization. Okay, phase 1 is demoralization. The goal of demoralization is to bring a society to its knees, to get them to stop trusting each other, to get them to start hating each other, to get them to lose faith in all institutions in a society, to the point where they decide, you know what, screw it, it's not working anymore, burn it to the ground, we'll rebuild something when we're done. That is the goal of demoralization. How you achieve it is by attacking every institution that is a bedrock of society. So if your society is religious, you want to attack that religion. If your society has strong organizations like the Boy Scouts or Rotary Club, you want to undermine those and make them less cool. Anywhere that you find strong bonds and relationships within a society, anything that brings people together needs to be attacked, demonized, and destroyed. And anytime you can fragment something, you want to. So, for example, let's say there's one primary religion, like there was in the United States, like in the 1950s. There were a lot of different flavors of Christianity, but Christianity was by far and away the largest religion in the United States. Well, the Soviets argued if we start introducing new religions and fragmenting it and like up the signal to noise ratio, that's going to fragment their people. And they were right. They were right. And I'm not making an argument for any religion. I'm a Zen Buddhist. I'm also a moderate politically. So like I'm the safest person on the planet to hate no matter what you believe because I empathize with everybody. Well, this demoralization process, you want to take all these structures and you want to undermine them. So again, if churches are trusted, get rid of them. You know, you want to make people think that these organizations that they've relied on that form their society are evil and alien and need to be torn down. So if they really trust law enforcement, for example, instead of law enforcement being portrayed in the media as strong and competent and helping people, they need to be evil. They need to be racist. They need to be wrong and at odds with society, because what will end up happening is now the police don't trust society. And now society doesn't trust police. Now replicate this, we're going to move on to the next phase, with the military. Anytime you see a military person, you want to show them as crazy, you want to show them as unstable, incompetent, racist, whatever negative traits that you can associate with them. Because if these are the people that defended the society in, say, World War II and were trusted, you know, when we get to the Vietnam War, you want to make sure that that's undermined. And it's interesting because this is all coming, again, from this gentleman, Yuri Bezmenov, let's say if I said that correct. His experiences and what he was paid to do and the process of subversion. So we were seeing this in action. In addition to the media and changing the way they see their own society, you know, you want to use critical theory to undermine a bunch of structures. And then you want to start affecting education. So what you do initially with education is not going to be anything over the top, like teaching that their society is evil. But you want to start by introducing things that are not useful to the society. So when a student graduates from high school, if their options are, I can go to get a degree and become an accountant or a lawyer or an engineer, or I can get a gender studies degree, one of them is not going to lead to productivity within society. And I want to be clear, I'm not demonizing gender studies degrees. If you've got one, hey, that's great. But I suspect you're probably not using that to leverage a career. And if you are, wonderful. I'd love to hear about it in the comments. But the argument here is that certain skills are going to be more useful in a society going forward. If you're trying to get to the moon, you know, in 1969, you're focusing on math and science and learning and scholastic power within your society and people really excelling. If you're focusing on gender studies, you're going to have an entirely different outcome. And that was their argument. So whether things are right or wrong, you get them to focus on traits that don't help the nation and ultimately will harm things economically and make the society worse all around, if that makes sense. And I know that sounds counterintuitive because you have movements like the Civil Rights Movement, which brought very necessary change within our society. But what the Soviets were arguing is we want to take that necessary change that is good, the things they're doing in their society, and you want to keep pushing it further and further and further and further and further until you've destroyed their unity, until everyone is fighting each other. And that's basically how how demoralization works. It takes 15 to 20 years, so an entire generation. It's not a quick process. But if over the course of 20 years, every movie that you show paints police officers a certain way, law enforcement a certain way, if every time you hear anything in school, it paints, you know, police a certain way, if you do that for a generation, now you've got a generation of adults who have certain ideas. And you do that for, let's say, 2 generations, 3 generations, 4 generations. You just can keep affecting whatever change you want to in a society. So that brings us to destabilization. If you can successfully demoralize a populace, you jump into destabilization, where you're trying to actively destabilize their society. We'll look at that next. Okay, so now we're into destabilization. We've got a demoralized society. The bonds of society are weakening. People don't trust each other anymore. They believe that the only way to resolve problems is through violence. If I am a Democrat, I believe that Republicans can't be reasoned with. They're so alien and so different from me that they're almost a different life form, and there's no hope of us ever finding any common ground. And if I'm a Republican, I feel exactly the same way. So both sides hate each other. You know, it can be white versus black, it can be green versus red, it can be aliens versus humans. It doesn't really matter. And if you want a great example of this whole process in action and can stomach an older show, I highly recommend the classic miniseries, because it illustrates this whole process that I'm trying to get across in a video. And I don't know how well I'm getting it across, but this TV show does an excellent job of it. It's based on a book that came out in 1936 called It Can't Happen Here, about the possible rise of fascism in the United States. And it's funny because sales of that book surged both when Trump was elected and when Biden was elected. So, you know, the people on either side of the political aisle, I mean, they're both feeling the same way. It's just who they think is the right person or the wrong person is different. But both of them are terrified because, you know, that's kind of how destabilization works. The goal, again, is to get more violent clashes until society actually starts to collapse and we move into the next phase, crisis. And typically, demoralization takes 15 to 20 years. Destabilization is going to take you about 5. And the goal is to have crime increase, inflation increase, radicalization increase. You want to introduce more societal organizations that have power, even though no one's elected them. But they decide that they have power and they start pushing different ideals in society. And it doesn't matter what these ideals are, it just matters that they're different and that people will have a hard time accepting them. And the more groups that you have doing this, the better, because then people start to fight. You know, if you have 12 different competing ideas of what the right idea is, then everybody's fighting over that, what the correct one is. And again, that's your whole goal: fragment a society, get them fighting and weaken their relationships, because you want them to either go into civil war or be weak enough that you can invade them. So crime increases, inflation starts going up. Does that sound familiar to anybody? Your grocery bill going up a little bit? Families stop talking to each other. Governments deadlock and cease to function. Does anybody have faith in their government? Again, I don't care what political party you're in. It's hard to feel like any government in any corner of the world really has our best interest in mind at this point. I have friends in Greece and Australia and, you know, Africa and Asia, and everybody seems to feel the same way everywhere. You're going to try to weaken the society and undermine whatever structures of power still remain, whatever organizations are keeping it together, whatever unifying areas that you have. And the more areas that you can get people to disagree, the better. By the end of this, you need relationships to completely break down. And if you want to look at a real-world example of this, you can look at the term Balkanization and how this happened. And this is terrifying, because you take people that were neighbors and were going to barbecues with each other, and 3 years later they were killing each other in the streets and doing absolutely horrific things. I mean, I'm not even going to talk about it because it'll depress you, but they were just tearing each other apart, and it happened in just a few years, because you had this process of subversion, and you have this fragmentation where people stop seeing each other as part of a unified whole and people that we should be cognizant of and should care about, and they start thinking more in tribal groups. And that's part of the goal of subversion, getting that to occur. So if you are successful, then your society is going to be destabilized. So let's say that we've had our demoralization, our society is demoralized, now we're 5 years in the future after that, things have begun to destabilize, now we need a crisis. This typically starts with an external crisis. Tell me if this sounds familiar to anybody. Let's say, like, oh, I don't know, a pandemic sweeping through that forces everybody to stay indoors and isolate. If you want to change people's behavior, how and when you do that is you force them to self-isolate. And I'm not saying that they're willfully trying to change our behavior, but I am saying that as a paranoid science fiction author, I'm aware of the fact that that is a tool that is often used to modify behavior: isolation. So it scares us and gets our brains working over time. Okay, so assuming you're successful, now we're rolling into phase 3, crisis. So you've taken your society, they've been demoralized for a while, now it is destabilized, and they're starting to fight each other. And there's violence, and crime has risen, and inflation's out of control, and now we get an external crisis, like, let's say, a pandemic. Let's say, I don't know, climate change that's causing wildfires globally. I mean, if I live in California, we have worse wildfires every single year. Droughts, sound familiar to anybody? Droughts are happening globally at a rate they've never occurred at before. Our population is massive. And I'm not just talking in any one area. North America, South America, Asia, Europe. I have friends in Greece that are dealing with wildfires. I mean, it's nuts. This stuff is happening everywhere at the same time. So the phase three is you look for a crisis like this. You look for, hey, we've got wildfires, sweeping through. Hey, we've got, political upheaval. You find all of these natural crises that are going on, and then you exacerbate them and you push and you push and you push. So you're going to use media to get everybody on one side to hate each other, and then everybody on the other side to get, hate each other, and force more and more armed conflicts. And this is pretty terrifying for me in California because we're seeing them. So Modesto's not too terribly far away from me. We saw an armed conflict between Antifa and the Proud Boys. You're seeing more and more of that all over the place. And it's getting worse, and police are basically just standing by in a lot of instances because they've been defunded and they themselves have been demoralized. They've been told that they are the evil of society and causing all of our problems. Wow, it's crazy seeing this in the United States. And I want to stress, it's important not to fall down the conspiracy hole and assume that things are definitely going to happen. When we see bad things happening in society as an author, I'll extrapolate outwards and the next thing you know, it's Mad Max. But in the real world, it's much more likely we as a sane society are going to come to and be like, wait a minute, we need to fix this. I do think this is just growing pains largely, and that we're going to figure out how social media works and how to use it as a species better. And we're going to have a little bit less fragmentation, I hope, over time. In any case, back to the subversion process. Now, our crisis is in full swing. Let's say we've got a drought and we've got wildfires and the government can't combat any of these and people are hungry, and so we're having food shortages and violence is increasing and crime is increasing. Now you've got a populace who will do anything just to have the problem be solved. And they're also looking for a target. So as a leader, if you're the subverter at this point, what you do is you paint a target. Let's say you are, this guy Adolf. You point at the Jews and you say, these are the sorts of the problems. We should wipe these people out. And, your society, who is eager to have any sort of enemy and any sort of sane path, any solution to get them back to what they consider to be normal, is going to do things they wouldn't ordinarily do. And so they start pushing the envelope and doing worse and worse things as a society. And you can get them to do this, which tears society apart because there's a lot of people in that society who aren't willing to do those terrible things. And they, of course, clash with the people who are. So you start, creating more problems around this crisis. And then finally, this is the last phase, normalization. It's very short. You step in and fix it. And when I say fix it, you fix it with violence. You have a military coup, you kill, the bad people who are causing the problem, and you solve the crisis. And so in the short term, that crisis is now solved. You now have a strong authoritarian government, and the people are actually happy because the crisis has been averted. So they're a little upset. Maybe they had to give up some freedoms, but they were able to put this new government in control. And if you go back to the gentleman that was espousing this whole philosophy, and I'll link the video in the comments if I can find it, we can see this playing out in a lot of different nations in the world over the past century. So it's not like a new thing. I really looked into the history of Bangladesh, even just some cursory time on YouTube and or Wikipedia will give you some basics of it. The same thing with Yugoslavia and Balkanization. I mean, you can look at a lot of different areas in the world where societies came apart at the seams as a result of direct subversion, where people were tampering with their systems. And that's not the only thing that occurs. These can obviously happen naturally too. Like, it's not like somebody has to be sitting there trying to take a society out. A society can take itself out, if it's doing these things. But the whole point of me making this video, and I know it's long and rambling, and I have no idea how it's going to be received, is I feel like we as a species and a society are less tolerant than we used to be, and less willing to talk to each other, and less willing to hear opposing viewpoints. And I would love to see that change in time. And I don't know how to achieve that, But I worry about what's happening to my society, and I worry about some sort of authoritarian government rising in our lifetimes. I think that's a little bit terrifying. We could really end up with a one world government. And if you had said that back in 2007 when I was going down the conspiracy theory rabbit hole, it would have sounded crazy. But I say it today, and now it's like, whoa, that's crazy. It feels like they're marching that direction. So, anyway, guys, love each other, be good to each other. If you have questions about Subversion as a process or writing it, I'm going to be working this into my fiction in Shattered Gods. So you'll see some themes around this. Also, I highly, highly recommend that Classic V miniseries. I talked a little bit about it. I'll talk more about it. It holds up pretty well. The effects, obviously, are a bit terrible because it was TV in the early 80s, but the acting is good and the storyline is incredible. The whole idea of if we're not careful, it could happen here too, is very poignant in that show. Anyway, hopefully this is useful. I got to get back to the writing. I'll talk to you guys next week.